I was a lowly assistant at my own family business, treated like a disposable servant by my mother and brother. I thought I was entirely alone in the world after my father died. Then a billionaire client walked into our conference room for the biggest pitch of the decade. As I poured his coffee, I saw it. He was wearing a custom ring identical to the one I kept hidden around my neck, the only thing my father left me. When I confronted the billionaire right there in the boardroom, all the color drained from his face. He asked who my father was, and when I said his name, the billionaire started crying. What he revealed to me next brought my toxic family empire crashing down. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Tessa, and I am 33 years old. For years, I had been drowning in the shadows of Weston and Associates, the high-profile architecture firm run by my mother Barbara and my older brother Jason. The morning it all unraveled started like any other nightmare in that building. I was standing in our main glass-walled conference room, meticulously arranging hand-drawn, highly complex structural blueprints across the long mahogany table. These were not just random sketches. They were my secret designs, the work I poured my soul into when everyone else was asleep. I had laid them out briefly to double-check a load-bearing calculation. I never expected Jason to walk in early. My older brother strolled through the glass doors holding a steaming cup of espresso. He wore a custom-tailored suit and that familiar, arrogant smirk he had perfected over a lifetime. He did not break his stride as he walked past me. He flicked his wrist and intentionally tipped his cup. The scalding liquid splashed directly across my blueprints, ruining months of precise mathematical work. I gasped and scrambled to pull the papers away, but the dark brown stains had already soaked through the delicate vellum. I looked up expecting at least a fake apology. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and tossed it at my chest. "Clean it up, Tessa," he sneered. "You are an assistant, not an architect. Go fetch the catering before the billionaire arrives. We cannot have this room looking like a garbage dump." Before I could even formulate a response, the heavy glass doors swung open again. My mother Barbara marched into the room. She was the firm chief executive officer, a woman whose sharp suits matched her razor-sharp tongue. She stopped and glared at the mess on the table before her eyes snapped to me. She did not ask what happened. She never did. "Look at what you have done," Barbara snapped, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are completely careless. Harrison Caldwell arrives in 20 minutes for a pitch that could secure the Caldwell Tower contract, and you are making a mess with your useless little drawings." I gritted my teeth. "Mom." Jason spilled his coffee on purpose. "Do not call me Mom in the office," she interrupted sharply, "and do not blame your brother for your clumsiness. Jason is a visionary. You are a 33-year-old college dropout who cannot even organize a clean table. I only keep you employed out of maternal charity, Tessa. Do not make me regret my generosity. Get this trash out of here and bring in the refreshments." My cheeks burned with humiliation. I wanted to scream that I dropped out because they refused to help with my tuition after my father died while happily funding Jason. But arguing with my mother Barbara was entirely useless. I silently gathered my ruined blueprints, dumped them into the recycling bin, and hurried to the catering kitchen. As I arranged the expensive pastries and poured fresh coffee, I reached beneath the collar of my blouse. My fingers traced the heavy gold ring hanging from a hidden chain. It was a thick custom signet ring embedded with a piece of cracked obsidian. It was the only thing my father Thomas had left me before he passed away in disgrace. Holding it grounded me. I tucked it back under my shirt and pushed a heavy serving cart down the hallway. I arrived back at the conference room just as the VIP client was taking his seat at the head of the table. Harrison Caldwell was a legendary real estate mogul, a billionaire who controlled half the commercial properties in the city. He commanded the room without saying a word. Jason and Barbara were hovering around him, showing off their presentation materials. I quietly wheeled the cart to the corner and began pouring coffee. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but I focused on my job. I walked over to Harrison and placed a bone china cup right next to his elbow. "Thank you," he murmured, reaching for the handle. As his hand moved into the light, my entire world stopped. I froze completely, forgetting to pull my hand back from the table. There, on Harrison Caldwell's right index finger, was a heavy gold signet ring embedded with a piece of cracked obsidian. It was not just similar, it was a flawless, exact match to the ring resting against my chest. Every scratch on the gold band, every unique jagged edge of the black stone was identical. I stood there paralyzed, staring at the billionaire hand. Barbara noticed my hesitation immediately. "Tessa," she hissed under her breath, her eyes flashing with pure rage. "Step back right now. Go wait in the hall." I did not move. I could not. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I placed the silver serving tray down on the mahogany table with a loud, solid thud that made everyone in the room jump. "Sir," I said, my voice surprisingly loud and clear, "you are wearing my father ring." The entire room went silent. Jason let out an awkward laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. "I am so sorry, Mr. Caldwell," he stammered. "My assistant is a little confused today. We will have her replaced immediately." But Harrison Caldwell did not look at Jason or my mother. The billionaire slowly lowered his coffee cup and turned to look directly at me. All the color had completely drained from his weathered face, leaving him looking ashen and breathless. "Shut up!" Harrison ordered, his voice low, but carrying absolute authority. Jason and Barbara instantly clamped their mouths shut, staring at him in complete shock. Harrison kept his eyes locked on mine. His chest rose and fell heavily, as if he had just seen a ghost. "Who was your father?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood tall, refusing to back down. "My father was Thomas Weston," I replied. The moment I said his name, Harrison Caldwell closed his eyes. A single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. "This meeting is canceled," he announced to my horrified mother and brother. He looked back at me, his voice shaking with raw emotion as the silence stretched across the long mahogany table. I knew my life would never, ever be exactly the same again. The silence in the conference room shattered the moment Harrison Caldwell turned toward the heavy glass door. My mother, Barbara, let out a sharp gasp that sounded like all the oxygen had been violently sucked right out of her lungs. For a split second, she stood entirely frozen, staring at the broad back of the billionaire-tailored suit as he prepared to walk away. Then her cold gaze snapped directly to me, and I saw a level of pure thermonuclear rage in her dark eyes that I had never witnessed before. Her perfectly manicured hands curled into fists, and she lunged across the wide space between us. Before I could even attempt to step back, her fingers clamped around my upper arm like an iron vise. Her sharp acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my work blouse. "You stupid, useless girl!" Barbara hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "What have you done to us?" Jason scrambled around the mahogany table, almost tripping over his shoes in desperation to stop Harrison from walking out. "Mr. Caldwell, please wait," Jason begged, holding his hands up placatingly as he blocked the exit. "My assistant is clearly having some sort of mental episode today. She has been incredibly unstable for years now. Please do not let her sudden delusion ruin this presentation. We have all the structural models ready to show you." Harrison paused, with his hand hovering just inches from the heavy brass door handle. He turned back slowly, and for a brief, terrifying moment, his eyes met mine again. The profound sorrow I had seen there just seconds ago was completely gone. In its place was a mask of pure, cold corporate indifference. He had quickly realized the extreme danger of the situation. He saw the deep suspicion radiating from my mother and brother, and he instantly understood that showing any actual connection to me or my father would completely compromise whatever massive secret he was currently holding. He straightened his posture and fixed Jason with an icy glare that could have frozen a river. "I do not do business with architecture firms that cannot even control their basic catering staff." Harrison said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. If you allow an unstable assistant to interrupt $100 million pitch with ridiculous fantasies, I cannot possibly trust you. Get her out of my sight right now. His harsh words were a physical blow to my chest, but I saw the slight, almost imperceptible nod he gave me right before he turned his head. He was playing a very specific part. My mother, however, took his angry words as absolute gospel. Her tight grip on my arm intensified until I winced in actual physical pain. She yanked me forward so violently, I nearly dropped the silver serving tray I was still awkwardly clutching against my stomach. You are fired, Tessa. Barbara screamed, completely abandoning her polished executive persona in front of the most important client she had ever landed. You are done working here. I gave you a job out of the goodness of my heart when you dropped out of school, and this is exactly how you repay my generosity. You ruined the most important deal in the entire history of Weston and Associates because you are obsessing over that worthless piece of junk around your neck. You are like your father, a complete failure and the ultimate embarrassment to this entire family. The mention of my father Thomas sent a fresh wave of hot anger rushing through my veins. I wanted to tell the room that she and Jason were frauds, relying on my unpaid architectural designs while treating me like a maid for the last decade. But I bit my tongue hard enough to taste copper. Causing a larger scene would only give them more ammunition to paint me as the unstable, crazy daughter they always claimed I was. I pulled my arm out of my mother's grasp and stood up perfectly straight. I do not need you to fire me, Mom, I said, keeping my voice deadly calm, despite the storm raging inside my chest. I am leaving. Jason sneered viciously, stepping right between me and the billionaire. You are not just leaving Tessa, you are being escorted off the premises immediately. He grabbed my shoulder with unnecessary force, shoving me roughly toward the hallway. Do not ever show your face in this building again. I stumbled forward, struggling to keep my balance as Jason propelled me toward the heavy glass doors. The humiliation burned fiercely in my chest, but I kept my head high, gripping my father obsidian ring tightly through the fabric of my shirt. As Jason shoved me aggressively past Harrison Caldwell, the billionaire shifted his stance. He stepped slightly into my direct path, making it look like a natural adjustment of his weight as he reached for his briefcase. I collided hard with his shoulder. It was a solid, jarring bump that knocked me sideways. Watch where you are going, Harrison barked, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. But in the tiny fraction of a second that our bodies pressed together, I felt his large hand brush against my hip. His fingers moved with lightning speed, slipping something smooth and rigid deep into the front pocket of my canvas work apron. The movement was so fluid and incredibly discreet that neither my mother nor my brother could possibly have seen it happen. I gasped from the unexpected impact but kept moving, letting my momentum carry me out the doors and into the long carpeted hallway. Jason followed me all the way down the hall to the elevator bank, his face red with pure, unfiltered rage. He jabbed the call button repeatedly. You have really done it this time, you pathetic loser, Jason spat as we waited. Mom is going to make absolutely sure you never find a job in this city again. You are going to be living on the streets by the end of the month. The elevator arrived with a soft metallic chime. I stepped inside, turning to face him, as the metal doors began to slide shut. At least I actually know how to draft a load-bearing blueprint, Jason, I said softly right before the doors closed completely, cutting off his furious red face. The elevator car slowly began its descent. I was completely alone. The adrenaline drained away, leaving me leaning against the mirrored wall. My breathing was ragged and my arm throbbed intensely where my mother had grabbed me. I had just lost my job and any remaining semblance of a healthy relationship with my biological family. But my mind was entirely focused on the deliberate collision. I reached into my apron pocket. My fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. I pulled it out. It was a sleek, heavy black magnetic keycard with no hotel logo or branding. Wrapped tightly around it was a small piece of premium stationery. I unfolded the paper carefully. The sharp, jagged handwriting contained only a few simple words written in dark blue ink. Midnight, The Caldwell penthouse. Come alone. I stood perfectly still and stared at the brief note. I realized that this was not just about a ring. There is a massive hidden layer to my father death that my mother has been concealing. The midnight air was biting as I stood on the pavement outside the grand glass doors of the Caldwell Tower Hotel. I looked down at the sleek black keycard in my palm, feeling the heavy weight of my father obsidian ring pressing against my chest. The opulent lobby was completely empty except for a lone security guard standing near the private elevator bank. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked past him, anticipating a shout or a heavy hand on my shoulder. Instead, the guard glanced at the black card in my hand, stepped back, and gave me a respectful nod. I swiped the card over the scanner, and the elevator doors slid open immediately. There were no buttons inside, just a single glowing screen that read, "Penthouse access granted." The ride up to the top floor felt like an eternity. My mind raced with questions about my father. For decades, my mother had drilled into my head that Thomas Weston was a useless drunk who squandered our family savings and drank himself into an early grave. She made sure I felt the shame of his legacy every single day of my life. The elevator chimed softly, and the doors opened directly into a massive, dimly lit living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a staggering panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Standing by the glass, looking out over the glowing city, was Harrison Caldwell. He had discarded his tailored suit jacket and tie, looking surprisingly vulnerable in a simple white dress shirt. When he turned to face me, the cold, ruthless billionaire I had encountered in the boardroom was completely gone. In his place was an exhausted older man with deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. He pointed to a plush leather armchair across from a low glass table. "Please, sit down, Tessa," he said, his voice gentle and devoid of its previous harshness. "I apologize for my behavior earlier today. If I had shown even a fraction of recognition, your mother would have known my true intentions and destroyed the one chance I had to bring you here." I remained standing, clutching the strap of my worn canvas tote bag. "You knew my father," I said, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempts to keep it steady. "You have his ring." Harrison let out a heavy sigh and slowly walked over to the table. He raised his right hand, letting the light catch the cracked obsidian stone set in the heavy gold band. "I did not just know Thomas," he replied softly. "He was my best friend, my brilliant partner, and the original co-founder of everything you see around you today." I stared at him in pure disbelief. "My mother always told me my father was a failed draftsman." I whispered the old lies, tasting like ash in my mouth. "She said he embezzled money from her firm to feed his addictions and left us with absolutely nothing." Harrison's expression hardened with a sudden, fierce anger. "Barbara is a master manipulator who built her entire kingdom on a foundation of venomous lies. Your father was a genius, Tessa. He had a mind for structural architecture that no one in this city could rival. 30 years ago, Thomas and I built Caldwell Industries together from the ground up. He designed the buildings, and I secured the real estate. We were brothers in every way that mattered. We commissioned these matching rings when we signed our first major contract." Harrison sank heavily into the armchair across from me, rubbing his temples. But Barbara was never satisfied with shared glory. She wanted total control. "When your father finalized a series of groundbreaking sustainable architectural patents, Barbara realized they were worth billions. She orchestrated an elaborate frame-up, falsifying financial records to make it look like Thomas was stealing from our corporate accounts. She used a young, fiercely loyal Jason to plant doctored documents in your father's personal files. They backed him into a corner, threatening to send him to federal prison if he did not walk away quietly. My knees gave out and I sank into the chair opposite him. My mother and brother had destroyed him. The image of my father, face pale and exhausted during his final days, flashed through my mind. He had not been drinking himself to death. He had been crushed by the ultimate betrayal. He walked away to protect you." Harrison continued, his voice breaking slightly. Barbara threatened to drag your name through the mud and ensure you were taken from him permanently if he fought the embezzlement charges. He gave up everything so you would not be caught in the crossfire. But he was not stupid. Before Barbara could officially steal the patent rights, Thomas executed a brilliant legal maneuver that she never knew about. He locked his entire 50% ownership stake of the Caldwell empire behind an ironclad dual signature trust. Harrison stood up and walked over to a large abstract painting on the far wall. He pressed a hidden mechanism, and the painting swung open, revealing a heavy steel wall safe. He quickly dialed in a combination and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a leather folder. He placed the folder gently on the glass table between us. "I have guarded the first half of this trust for 2 decades," Harrison explained, tapping the heavy folder. "I have absolute control over my 50% of Caldwell Industries. But the other half, the billions of dollars generated by your father's original patents, remains completely frozen in a holding account. I have spent years searching for you, Tessa, but Barbara legally changed your social security routing and buried your documentation to keep you entirely dependent on her. She wanted to make sure you never discovered who you truly were." I reached out with a shaking hand and touched the leather folder. "How do we unlock it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Harrison smiled for the first time, a genuine warm expression that transformed his entire face. "The trust requires 2 things to activate," he said. "It requires my physical signature alongside my obsidian ring, and it requires the verified biological bloodline heir of Thomas Weston presenting the exact matching ring." He pointed to the chain hidden beneath my collar. "Your father left you that ring because it is the literal key to your birthright. You are not a lowly assistant, Tessa. You are the rightful heir to half of a multi-billion-dollar empire." The magnitude of his revelation washed over me, completely shattering the pathetic reality I had accepted for my entire adult life. For 10 grueling years, I had fetched coffee-scrubbed conference tables and endured relentless psychological torment from the people who had murdered my father's spirit and stolen my rightful legacy. My mother had carefully engineered my poverty, ensuring I remained trapped under her thumb, too exhausted and financially terrified to ever ask questions. She had systematically stripped away my dignity while she and Jason paraded around the city, claiming the genius of Thomas Weston as their own. I slowly reached under my collar and pulled the heavy gold ring free from my shirt, letting the cracked obsidian stone rest against my collarbone. The cold metal suddenly felt warm, radiating a power I had never allowed myself to feel. I looked at the trust documents and then back at the billionaire. "We take everything back," I stated. I left the Caldwell Tower Hotel through a private service exit that Harrison showed me. The bitter midnight wind whipped through my thin jacket, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was reeling from the massive truth that had just completely shattered my reality. My father was not a thief. He was a brilliant pioneer who had been ruthlessly destroyed by his own wife. Every insult my mother had hurled at me, every moment of humiliation she forced me to endure, was designed to hide her own monumental guilt. I walked for over an hour through the dark city streets, needing the rhythmic pounding of my footsteps on the concrete to ground me. By the time I finally reached my neighborhood, it was pushing 3 in the morning. I lived in a dilapidated brick building on the edge of the industrial district. It was a far cry from the immaculate mansions my mother and brother occupied, but it was the only place I could afford on my assistant's salary. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my floor. The hallway smelled faintly of damp carpet and old cooking grease. I reached into my canvas tote bag for my keys. My hand froze halfway into the bag. The heavy wooden door to my apartment was standing slightly ajar. A sliver of harsh yellow light spilled out onto the hallway floor. My heart rate immediately spiked. I pushed the door open, the hinges whining loudly in the quiet night. The inside of my tiny apartment was completely trashed. Books were violently swept off the shelves and scattered across the small rug. The cushions of my thrifted sofa were tossed carelessly onto the floor. Standing right in the middle of my small living space was my older brother Jason. Beside him, leaning casually against the cheap kitchen counter, was his fiancée Vanessa. She wore a pristine white trench coat and a look of absolute boredom. Jason was furiously digging through the bottom drawer of my drafting desk. He was ripping out manila folders and tossing them over his shoulder without even looking at them. "What are you doing in my home?" I demanded, stepping fully into the room. Jason spun around. He did not look surprised to see me. In fact, his arrogant smirk immediately spread across his face. He held up a small stack of sleek silver external hard drives. He had found the hidden compartment at the back of my desk. My stomach dropped completely. Those drives contained everything. For the past 7 years, I had spent my nights designing highly complex, sustainable architectural blueprints. I mapped out energy-efficient skyscrapers and intricate structural support algorithms. It was my life work created entirely in the shadows, because my mother flatly refused to let me design officially at her firm. She wanted me securely trapped as a low-level assistant forever. "Give those back to me right now," I said, stepping toward him. I reached out, but Jason simply stepped back and slid the hard drive securely into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "I do not think so, Tessa," he sneered. "You were fired today for gross incompetence and insubordination. Mom realized we needed to confiscate any remaining company property you might be hiding in this dump." "These drives are my personal property," I fired back, keeping my voice low and dangerous. "My name is on every single file in that storage. I built those algorithms on my own personal computer, using my own personal software." Jason laughed loudly, a sharp barking sound that echoed in the small apartment. "You really are delusional, Tessa. You built absolutely nothing of value. You are a fired assistant who used company resources on company time to pursue a ridiculous little hobby. Legally, everything on these drives belongs exclusively to Weston and Associates." He patted his jacket pocket with immense satisfaction. "Our engineering team has been struggling heavily with the load-bearing calculations for the Caldwell Tower bid. I took a quick look at your files before you arrived. Your little hobby algorithms are actually going to be very useful for my presentation tomorrow." "You are stealing my work," I stated, staring directly into his cold eyes. "You are stealing my designs, just like you and Mom stole from my father." The mention of my father caused Jason's face to twitch with sudden violent anger. He took a threatening step forward, closing the physical distance between us. "Do not ever compare me to that pathetic drunk," Jason hissed, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "He was a colossal failure, and you are exactly like him. I am simply claiming the intellectual property of my firm. You should consider it a parting gift to the family that kept a roof over your head for so long despite your constant embarrassing behavior." "Speaking of a roof over your head," Vanessa suddenly chimed in. She pushed herself off the kitchen counter and sauntered slowly across the room. Her expensive designer heels clicked sharply against the cheap peeling linoleum floor. She stopped beside Jason and reached into her pristine white trench coat. She pulled out a thick folded piece of legal paper and held it out toward me between two perfectly manicured fingers. I did not take it. I just stared at the paper and then up at her heavily contoured face. "Take it, Tessa," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It is an official formal eviction notice." I frowned in genuine confusion. "You cannot evict me," I said. "I pay my rent on time every single month to the property management company." Vanessa let out a high-pitched giggle that grated against my ears. "Oh, Tessa, you really are clueless, are you not? The management company is just a shell corporation. Your mother owns this entire building. She bought it years ago specifically to keep an eye on you. She wanted to make sure you never saved enough money to actually leave the city and cause trouble. And since you completely humiliated her in front of Harrison Caldwell today, she has decided to terminate your lease. You have until Friday to remove your pathetic belongings from this property. Otherwise, the building superintendent will drag everything out to the dumpster." Jason checked his expensive watch and adjusted his suit jacket. "We are leaving now," he announced. I have a massive billion-dollar presentation to finalize, and I need to integrate your stolen algorithms into my structural model. Enjoy your final few days in this garbage dump, Tessa. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm, and they walked past me toward the open door. Jason intentionally bumped his shoulder against mine, just as he had done earlier in the boardroom. They walked down the hallway, leaving the door wide open behind them. I stood in my ruined living room, listening to their footsteps fade away. I did not fall to my knees. I did not shed a tear. Any person would have been utterly crushed by the sudden loss of their life work and home. But I was not the same broken assistant who had woken up this morning. I reached beneath my shirt and wrapped my hand around the cold, heavy gold of my father obsidian ring. A dark, cold smile spread across my face. Let Jason take those drives to the board meeting. He had no idea what he was walking into. The war had escalated and I was armed. The morning sun barely cut through the heavy clouds over the city as I sat in a vinyl booth at a diner near my apartment. The bitter coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I did not care. My eyes were glued to the screen of my phone. Weston and Associates had called an emergency press conference at 9 sharp. They were broadcasting live from the main atrium of their corporate headquarters. I watched as my mother Barbara stepped up to the podium. She wore a sharp crimson suit that screamed power and control. Flashing cameras illuminated her composed face as she gripped the wooden lectern. Today marks a monumental turning point for Weston and Associates, she announced. We have developed a revolutionary sustainable framework for the Caldwell Tower bid, a design so advanced it redefines modern architecture. And the brilliant mind behind this masterpiece is none other than our lead visionary and vice president. I give you the true heir to the Weston genius, my son Jason. The reporters broke into applause as Jason confidently strutted to the microphones. He looked immaculate in a navy suit, flashing his signature winning smile. Behind him, a massive screen flickered to life, displaying the exact blueprints he had stolen from my apartment just hours ago. The breath caught in my throat as I saw my own intricate line work and structural curves projected for the world to see. Jason adjusted his tie and began to speak. He effortlessly regurgitated the technical notes he had memorized from my personal files. He described the wind load matrices and solar algorithms as if he had spent years developing them himself. He soaked up the flashing cameras and the adoring gaze of our mother, taking full, unadulterated credit for my sweat and tears. I took a deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling an overwhelming calm settling deep into my bones. They had taken the bait perfectly. I left cash on the diner table and caught a cab to Caldwell Industries headquarters. Harrison had provided me with a secure number the night before. One text message was all it took for his head of security to meet me at an underground loading dock and escort me through a private elevator. Within minutes, I was stepping into Harrison's massive executive office on the 80th floor. He was standing by his desk watching the very same press conference on a flat-screen monitor. He turned the volume down as I walked across the plush carpet. "They certainly move fast," Harrison remarked. His eyes narrowed in deep disgust as Jason's face filled the screen. "I assume those are the designs you told me about." I nodded, taking a seat facing his desk. Jason broke into my apartment at 3 in the morning and confiscated my hidden hard drives. I explained, keeping my voice steady. "He thinks he can use my structural models to secure your billion-dollar contract." Harrison leaned back, crossing his arms. His expression grew incredibly serious. "If those designs are as sound as you claim, he is going to walk into my boardroom and hand me a flawless presentation. Barbara will demand the advance funding immediately. We cannot allow them to secure that capital, Tessa. If they get $100 million, they will have the resources to bury us in litigation when we activate your father trust." I looked up at the billionaire and allowed a genuine smile to break across my face. "Do not worry, Harrison," I said softly. "Jason is walking into a digital guillotine." Harrison raised a gray eyebrow, leaning closer. "Explain it to me," he demanded. I pulled my canvas tote bag onto my lap. I knew my mother and brother better than anyone. I began. I knew that if they ever discovered my private work, they would instantly steal it and claim it as their own. So I built a fail-safe directly into the core coding of the computer-aided design files. It is an incredibly complex structural flaw, buried so deep within the underlying mathematics that Jason would never be able to spot it with his limited technical knowledge. Harrison's eyes widened with sudden intense interest. Go on, he urged, pushing away from the desk. I embedded a digital watermark combined with a massive load-bearing trap, I explained. The blueprints look visually flawless on the surface. They even pass basic preliminary software checks. But the central atrium of the tower design relies on a highly specific weight distribution algorithm to remain stable. I intentionally scrambled that underlying mathematical sequence in the files Jason stole. If anyone tries to run a live three-dimensional stress test simulation on those stolen blueprints, the virtual framework will not be able to calculate the structural tension. The entire digital model will mathematically collapse under its own simulated weight. Harrison let out a low whistle, running a hand over his jaw, as a predatory grin spread across his weathered face. So, without your specific correcting algorithm, the building is virtually unbuildable, he stated with growing excitement. It is a catastrophic failure waiting to happen on screen. Exactly, I confirmed. Jason thinks he stole a completed masterpiece, but he actually stole a ticking time bomb. He does not possess the architectural understanding to recognize the trap, let alone fix it. When he runs that simulation, the software will flag a fatal structural error. Harrison began to pace across the thick carpet, his mind clearly racing with the strategic possibilities. This is brilliant, Tessa. He murmured, his eyes gleaming with the same ruthless business instinct that had helped him build his massive empire. We need to force them to run that simulation publicly before they have any chance to hand the files over to an external engineering firm for review. We have to trap them in the room with their own stolen lies. He abruptly stopped pacing and marched over to his desk. He slammed his hand down on the intercom button. Yes, Mr. Caldwell. A crisp voice answered immediately. Contact the entire executive board and the lead structural engineering team, Harrison ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. I want them assembled in the main presentation room tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. Then contact Barbara Weston. Tell her I was so incredibly impressed by her son press conference this morning that I am accelerating the timeline for the Caldwell Tower bid. I demand a full live stress test presentation from Weston and Associates tomorrow morning. Harrison released the intercom button and turned back to face me. The predatory grin on his face had hardened into something far more dangerous. They are going to be scrambling all night to prepare for a sudden live presentation, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. Jason Arrogance will not let him back down from the challenge. He will walk right into my boardroom and hit execute on a simulation he does not understand. And when it violently crashes and burns, he will look like an absolute fool in front of the most powerful people in this industry. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling the heavy weight of my father's obsidian ring resting against my chest. They took everything from him, I said softly, remembering the broken man who had died in disgrace. Now they are going to lose everything they built on his stolen legacy. The next morning, the executive boardroom of Caldwell Industries was a fortress of polished mahogany and thick, soundproof glass. It was on the highest floor, offering a panoramic view of the city, making people feel like untouchable gods. Harrison Caldwell sat at the massive table, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Flanking him were 15 elite corporate directors and structural engineers in the country. I was not in the room but was watching a live, secure video feed from a private office down the hallway. My heart beat in a steady rhythm as the heavy brass doors swung open. My mother Barbara and older brother Jason walked in. They looked absolutely triumphant. Barbara wore a sharp crimson power suit and an expression of supreme entitlement as she took her seat. Jason stood at the front, adjusting his tie before plugging his laptop into the system. He did not look nervous at all. He looked like a man who believed he had already won the ultimate lottery. Jason began his presentation with a practiced, polished charm. He clicked a button, and the massive screens around the boardroom illuminated with my complex blueprints. He walked the board through the initial phases of the Caldwell Tower, speaking with an arrogant confidence making my stomach churn. He pointed to the energy-efficient solar grids and intricate glass latticework, using the phrasing he had stolen from my personal notes. For the first 20 minutes, the room was captivated. Several board members nodded in quiet approval. Barbara sat back, beaming with maternal pride as she watched her golden child dazzle the executives. Jason moved on to the centerpiece of the entire project, the towering central atrium. He boasted about the unprecedented open space and the delicate twisting arches that would support the upper 90 floors. It was a breathtaking visual concept, but it required a microscopic level of mathematical precision to stand upright. Jason spoke about the weight distribution using big architectural buzzwords, but I could tell he was just reciting stolen lines. He did not understand the underlying physics of what he was presenting. Just as Jason paused to let his supposed genius sink in, a voice cut through the quiet boardroom. It was Marcus, an older, stern-looking structural engineer who served on the Caldwell board. I had met with Marcus early that morning under Harrison's strict orders. Marcus leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he peered intently at the glowing screen. "The aesthetic is certainly ambitious," Jason Marcus said, his voice dry and highly skeptical. "However, I am looking at your foundational support pillars for that central atrium. The load-bearing calculations you are proposing are unprecedented for a structure of this immense height. The wind shear alone would put catastrophic tension on those twisting arches." Jason maintained his arrogant smirk. He dismissed the older engineer concern with a wave of his hand. "The mathematics are perfectly sound," Marcus Jason replied smoothly. "I have run the numbers dozens of times. Our firm guarantees the absolute stability of this design." Marcus did not back down. In fact, he leaned in closer. "If you are that confident, then you will not mind proving it to the board right now," Marcus challenged. "Run the live three-dimensional stress test simulation. Let us see how your delicate arches hold up to a simulated Category 5 wind load." A brief flicker of hesitation crossed Jason's face, but his overwhelming ego quickly pushed it aside. He had seen the completed blueprints. He assumed the simulation software would simply validate the pretty pictures on his screen. "Of course," Jason said, turning back to his laptop. "I would be more than happy to demonstrate the flawless structural integrity of my work." He clicked a few buttons and pulled up the advanced simulation program. The room fell completely silent as the three-dimensional model of the Caldwell Tower appeared on the massive monitors. Jason confidently hit execute. At first, the virtual building stood perfectly still. The software began applying simulated gravity and basic environmental pressure. Then the heavy wind load parameters kicked in. A digital overlay of green arrows hit the side of the tower. Almost instantly, the base of the twisting arches in the central atrium flashed a bright warning yellow. Jason frowned, leaning closer to his laptop screen. The yellow rapidly shifted to a glaring, angry orange. The virtual support pillars began to visibly buckle under the simulated physical weight. Suddenly, the entire screen flashed a blinding, violently bright red. A loud, automated warning klaxon blared through the boardroom speakers. Giant, bold letters appeared across the monitors, reading "Catastrophic Structural Failure." The digital tower folded in on itself and completely collapsed into a virtual pile of shattered glass and twisted steel. The boardroom erupted into a loud chorus of shocked gasps and angry murmurs. Barbara shot up out of her chair, her face rapidly draining of all its color. Jason froze, completely paralyzed, as the flashing red warning lights reflected off his suddenly sweating forehead. He frantically began clicking his mouse, trying to reset the program, trying to erase the massive failure displayed for the entire room to see. But the software simply replayed the violent building collapse over and over again. Harrison Caldwell slammed his open palm down on the mahogany table, silencing the room instantly. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Jason Harrison demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You just presented a skyscraper that would kill thousands of innocent people." Jason was visibly panicking now. His polished charm completely evaporated, leaving behind a sweating, stammering mess. He pulled up the source code, fumbling wildly through lines of complex algorithms he had never studied and could not possibly comprehend. He scrolled desperately, searching for a simple error, a typo, anything he could quickly fix to save his billion-dollar payday. But the digital watermark I had planted was buried entirely too deep, woven directly into the very fabric of the math. There was no easy fix. There was only absolute professional ruin. "I do not understand," Jason stammered, wiping heavy beads of sweat from his upper lip. "The files were absolutely perfect last night. The initial calculations were absolute perfection. I checked them myself." The board members began to aggressively question his basic competence, throwing technical architectural terms at him that made his eyes dart around the room in sheer absolute terror. Barbara stepped forward, her maternal instincts morphing into pure corporate survival mode. She tried to deflect the blame, throwing up her hands. "Gentlemen, please, there must be a glitch in your presentation software," Barbara pleaded. "My son is a true visionary. His designs are flawless." Marcus shook his head in absolute disgust. "The software is functioning perfectly," Barbara Marcus stated firmly. "Your son design is fundamentally flawed. It is a massive structural death trap." Cornered, humiliated, and facing the sudden, terrifying loss of the Caldwell contract, Jason finally snapped. His eyes went wide and wild as he desperately searched for any possible lifeline. He pointed a trembling finger at the ruined digital building on the screen. "It was not me," Jason screamed, his voice cracking with high-pitched panic. "It was my assistant. My incompetent fired assistant Tessa. She was escorted out of our building yesterday for having a massive psychological breakdown. She must have maliciously scrambled my personal files before she left. She hacked into my secure system out of pure spite to ruin this presentation. She is completely crazy. She intentionally sabotaged my flawless masterpiece to destroy our company. I am the true victim here." Jason sobbed, desperately wiping his sweaty face. My mother rushed forward, shifting into damage control mode. She placed a hand on Jason's shoulder and looked out at the wealthy executives with a practiced expression of deep maternal sorrow. "Please forgive my son, gentlemen," Barbara said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "He is covering for a family tragedy. The assistant he mentioned is my daughter Tessa. She has suffered from severe psychological instability for years. We kept her employed out of familial duty, but her condition has deteriorated into vicious paranoia. She was terminated yesterday and broke into our servers overnight to sabotage Jason's brilliant work. Our IT department is purging her malicious virus right now. We just need a few hours to restore the original files." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, uncomfortable with this sudden airing of dirty laundry. Marcus, the lead structural engineer, crossed his arms and stared at Barbara with cold disbelief. Before anyone could respond, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud. Every head turned. I stepped across the threshold. I was no longer wearing the cheap canvas aprons or ill-fitting slacks my mother mandated for my assistant uniform. Instead, I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that fit me perfectly, paired with a crisp white blouse. My shoulders were pulled back, my spine straight. I walked into the lion den with absolute confidence. Barbara's mouth fell open in sheer horror. She let go of Jason and took a frantic step toward me. "Security!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Call the guards immediately. This woman is a terminated employee and she is trespassing." Jason was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between me and the glowing red failure on the presentation screens. "How did you get in here?" he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You need to leave right now, Tessa. You have done enough damage." I ignored their frantic shouting. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes locked on the digital whiteboard at the front of the room. The virtual Caldwell Tower was still collapsed on the monitors, bathed in angry red warning lights. I walked with steady steps past the polished table of elite executives. The board members watched me in stunned silence, parting slightly as I approached the presentation podium. Barbara lunged forward, trying to block my path, but I sidestepped her without breaking stride. I reached the console and gently nudged Jason out of the way. He was too paralyzed by panic to offer physical resistance. I stood before the digital interface and placed my hands on the keyboard. "You are looking at a fundamental instability in the tensile load distribution," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent boardroom. The twisting arches of the central atrium are designed to absorb and redirect wind shear, but the current mathematical sequence applies linear pressure rather than dynamic dispersion. The virtual model is collapsing because it is calculating the stress of a rigid pillar, not a flexible lattice. Marcus leaned forward in his leather chair, his eyes widening behind his glasses. "Can you fix it?" he asked, his tone devoid of skepticism. I did not answer him with words. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the core structural algorithm that Jason had fumbled with. Line after line of complex code cascaded down the screen. I deleted the corrupted sequences I had planted the night before and began to weave the correct framework back into the design. I adjusted the weight-bearing ratios, recalculating the strength of the glass and steel joints in real time. The boardroom was dead silent except for the rapid clicking of the keys. I could feel the gaze of 15 elite engineers burning into my back, but my hands never shook. I was in my element. This was my design, my life work, and I knew every fraction of an inch of its structure. After exactly 45 seconds, I hit the execute key. The screens above us flickered. The angry red warning lights vanished, replaced by a soothing, cool blue. The collapsed three-dimensional model of the tower rebuilt itself, rising majestically from the virtual ground. The wind load simulation restarted. Green arrows battered the twisting arches, but this time the structural pillars absorbed the force perfectly. The stress distributed exactly as I intended, keeping the central atrium completely intact and flawlessly stable under maximum pressure. A collective breath was released around the mahogany table. Marcus let out a soft sound of pure awe, staring at the stabilized model. The sheer brilliance of the revised algorithm was undeniable. The elite board members began nodding to each other, whispering in low, impressed tones. They instantly realized they were looking at the true architect. The facade was completely shattered. Barbara realized it too. The illusion she had spent 10 years carefully constructing was entirely destroyed in under a minute. Driven by absolute humiliation and desperate rage, she completely lost her mind. "You miserable little thief!" Barbara screamed, lunging at me with her acrylic nails extended like claws. She aimed directly for my face, attempting to physically drag me away from the podium by my hair. Jason abruptly snapped out of his paralyzed state and charged forward alongside her, his hands balled into tight, heavy fists, raised to physically forcefully throw me completely out of the room. But they never even made it within 3 feet of me. Harrison Caldwell raised a single finger. Two massive security guards materialized from the shadows near the back doors, moving with terrifying speed and precision. They intercepted my mother and brother instantly. One guard slammed a heavy hand onto Jason's chest, violently shoving the vice president backward until he crashed hard into the wall. The other guard grabbed Barbara by both of her arms, pinning her firmly against the edge of the conference table. Barbara shrieked indignantly, struggling violently and entirely uselessly against the massive security guard iron grip. "Release me this instant," she demanded, her face a mask of furious indignation. "I am the chief executive officer of this architectural firm, and I absolutely demand your respect." Harrison stood up very slowly from the head of the long table. He buttoned his suit jacket, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying power that instantly silenced her protests. "You demand absolutely nothing in my building, Barbara," Harrison said, his voice dropping down to a deadly, chilling register. "Your firm presented a catastrophic failure that was only salvaged by the uninvited intervention of the woman you just tried to assault. That fact alone does not inspire confidence in your leadership or your supposed visionary son." Jason whimpered, pressing himself flat against the wall as the security guard glared at him. Harrison turned his attention to the glowing stable model of the tower and then looked directly at me. "The structural fix is undeniably brilliant," he announced loudly, ensuring every single board member heard him clearly. "However, I do not hand over $100 million advance based on a chaotic boardroom display. I require absolute certainty before I sign the final contracts. Harrison looked back at my mother, who was still pinned helplessly against the mahogany wood. I will make my final unalterable decision regarding the Caldwell Tower project and the release of the advance funding at my annual charity gala this Saturday night. He grabbed his briefcase and turned toward the door, leaving Jason and Barbara hanging by a thread. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind Harrison, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. I stood at the podium looking down at my mother and brother. Barbara was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she stared at the closed doors. Her face was a messy portrait of lingering rage and sudden calculating desperation. Jason remained plastered against the wall, rubbing his chest where the security guard had shoved him. He looked completely shattered. He slowly turned his gaze toward the digital whiteboard, where my perfectly stabilized three-dimensional model continued to effortlessly deflect the simulated wind shear. The sheer perfection of the design was mocking his utter incompetence. I did not say a single word to either of them. I simply reached down, grabbed my canvas tote bag, and walked straight toward the exit. Barbara opened her mouth to shout something, but the two massive security guards took a synchronized step forward. Her jaw snapped shut. I walked out of the boardroom feeling a profound sense of closure. I had finally shown them exactly what I was capable of, and I had done it on the biggest stage imaginable. 48 hours passed in a blur of anticipation. I spent the time working closely with Harrison Caldwell personal legal team, finalizing the necessary paperwork to officially activate my father dual signature trust. The cracked obsidian ring never left my side. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting in Harrison's expansive penthouse office going over the guest list for the upcoming charity gala. The event was going to be a massive spectacle filled with the wealthiest investors and real estate developers in the state. Barbara and Jason were explicitly required to attend to hear the final verdict on the contract. Harrison was sitting behind his massive desk reviewing a stack of digital tablets. Suddenly, his private secure phone began to vibrate violently across the polished wood. He picked it up and read the incoming text message. A slow, dark laugh rumbled deep in his chest. He looked up at me, his eyes sparkling with a dangerous kind of amusement. "It seems your mother greed has finally overridden whatever basic survival instincts she had left," Harrison said, gesturing for me to come around the desk. I stood up and walked over, standing beside his leather chair, to look at the tablet he was holding. The screen displayed a highly classified financial dossier. Harrison employed a team of elite corporate intelligence analysts whose sole job was to monitor the private financial movements of every major player in the city. They had just intercepted a massive flurry of panicked banking activity originating directly from Weston and Associates. "What am I looking at?" I asked, my eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers and legal jargon. "You are looking at the desperate actions of a woman who believes she has already won," Harrison replied, tapping a thick finger against the screen. "After your little display in the boardroom, Barbara clearly convinced herself that the Caldwell Tower contract is a guaranteed victory. She knows your algorithm fixed the structural flaw, and she thinks my demand for absolute certainty was just a standard corporate intimidation tactic. She genuinely believes I am going to hand her the $100 million advance tomorrow night." I frowned, staring at the massive red numbers highlighted on the digital report. But why would she need to move so much money around right now? Harrison leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Because she knows her firm does not actually have the operational liquidity to execute a mega project of this magnitude. If she wins the bid, she has to immediately deploy thousands of construction workers, secure mountains of raw materials, and lock down hundreds of subcontracts within days. That takes massive upfront capital. Capital she does not have. Barbara knows that before I sign the final contract, my accountants will demand proof of immediate operational liquidity. She needs to show my board that Weston and Associates is swimming in liquid cash right this second." I looked back at the screen, tracing the origin of the massive wire transfers. She did not go to a traditional bank, I noted, recognizing the names of several predatory private equity firms. "Standard banks require weeks of due diligence and forensic auditing," Harrison explained with a cold smile. "Barbara cannot pass a forensic audit. She has spent the last decade cooking her books to hide the money she embezzled from your father. She could never let a legitimate bank look closely at her ledgers. So she went to the corporate loan sharks. These are high-risk, high-yield lenders who do not ask questions as long as the collateral is ironclad. She took out a massive 48-hour bridge loan. It is a financial instrument designed to provide an instant massive injection of cash, just long enough to prove liquidity to a client before the real contract advance clears. My heart began to pound against my ribs as the sheer magnitude of what she had done finally registered. How much did she borrow? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. $250 million. Harrison stated, his tone perfectly flat. And because it is a completely unregulated predatory loan, the interest rate is mathematically astronomical. If she does not pay it back within exactly 48 hours, the penalties will immediately bankrupt her. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold shiver trace its way down my spine. What did she use for collateral? I already knew the answer before he even opened his mouth. Harrison looked up at me, his eyes burning with intense poetic justice. She leveraged the entire Weston and Associates asset portfolio, he said softly. Every single building, every patent, every corporate account, and every piece of intellectual property your father built. She signed it all over to the loan sharks. She bet the entire family firm on winning the advance at my gala tomorrow night. If I do not hand her that check, she will default on Monday morning. The private equity firms will seize Weston and Associates and completely liquidate it by Tuesday. I stepped back from the desk, my mind reeling from the staggering reality of her arrogance. My mother had willingly walked right into a financial guillotine. She had become so blinded by her own greed and her desperate need to secure the ultimate architectural prize that she had risked everything. She believed that because I had fixed the structural model, the tower was completely flawless. She thought I was just a bitter fired assistant trying to show off, and that she could simply steal my stabilized design and march to the bank. She had absolutely no idea that Harrison Caldwell already knew the truth about my father. She had no idea that the man holding her fate in his hands was actively working to destroy her. She was going to show up at the charity gala tomorrow night wearing her finest gown, expecting to be crowned the queen of the city skyline. Instead, she was going to be publicly executed. She really thinks she outsmarted us, I whispered, sinking slowly back into the leather chair opposite Harrison. She thinks she can just take the money and run. Harrison closed the digital tablet and tossed it onto his desk. Barbara Weston has spent her entire life stepping on the throats of better people to elevate herself, he said, his voice hard and unforgiving. She destroyed my best friend. She stole your future. She built an empire of lies and convinced herself she was untouchable. But arrogance always breeds fatal stupidity. She just handed us the absolute perfect weapon to obliterate her entirely. I reached under my collar and pulled the obsidian ring into the light. My father had walked away in disgrace to protect me, but Barbara had never allowed either of us peace. Now, for the first time, the balance was shifting. Harrison looked at me with a slow, dangerous smile. Tomorrow night, Tessa, he said, you take back your name. By sunset, Evelyn Harrison's public relations director had made sure every major critic, investor, and financial journalist would be at the gala. I did not return to my apartment. There was nothing left there that mattered. Harrison had booked me a quiet room at a boutique hotel under an assumed name, and as the cab carried me through the city, I watched the unfinished Caldwell Tower rise against the darkening sky. The trap was ready. All Barbara had to do was step into it. The next morning, I woke up in the crisp white sheets of the boutique hotel, feeling a strange sense of tranquility. For the first time in my life, I was not rushing to fetch dry cleaning or arrange breakfast meetings for people who despised me. I took my time getting dressed in a simple dark sweater and jeans before heading down to the hotel lobby. There was a quiet upscale coffee shop attached to the ground floor with large glass windows overlooking the bustling morning street. I ordered a black coffee and a pastry, taking a seat in a secluded leather booth in the back corner. I was just pulling out my phone to check for updates when the cafe door chimed softly right then. I did not look up immediately, But a familiar wave of expensive floral perfume rolled over my table, a second before she sat down. My mother slid into the booth opposite me. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat and oversized designer sunglasses, which she slowly removed and placed on the table. Her eyes swept over my casual clothing with a look of absolute revulsion. "It took my private investigator less than 3 hours to find you, Tessa," Barbara said, her voice a low, venomous purr. "You always were incredibly predictable. Did you really think you could just hide in a boutique hotel and avoid the consequences of your pathetic little stunt in the boardroom yesterday morning? You foolish little girl, listen closely now." I kept my hands wrapped around my warm coffee mug, refusing to let her see my pulse quicken. "I am not hiding from anyone," I replied, keeping my voice completely level. "I just wanted a decent cup of coffee without having to endure you and Jason." Barbara let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You are in no position to be insolent," she snapped, leaning forward across the table. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped an impatient rhythm against the polished wood. "You embarrassed our firm yesterday. You humiliated your brother in front of the most important clients in this city. But more importantly, you tried to sabotage a billion-dollar contract out of pure, petty jealousy. You are an extremely sick and twisted individual, Tessa Weston. You are mentally unstable, and you have finally crossed a line that I cannot simply sweep under the rug." She reached into her oversized leather handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. She slapped the papers down onto the table between us. I stared at the top page. The bold black letters at the top clearly read, "Non-disclosure and complete familial severance agreement." I looked back up at her, waiting for the explanation I knew she was dying to give. "You have been a parasite on this family for far too long," Barbara stated, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so the other patrons would not hear the absolute disgust dripping from her words. "I have clothed you, fed you, and employed you despite your constant failures. But yesterday proved that you are a genuine liability. Jason and I are about to secure the Caldwell Tower contract. We are going to bring in hundreds of millions of dollars to Weston and Associates. And I know exactly how your twisted little mind works. You are going to try and claim that you had some part in the structural design just because you threw a tantrum and pushed a few buttons on a keyboard." I looked at the legal document and then back at my mother. "You want me to sign away my rights to my own algorithms?" I asked, letting defeated sadness creep into my soft, quiet voice right now. "They were never your algorithms, Tessa," she sneered. "You developed them on company time using company resources. They belong to Jason. But to ensure that you do not drag our name through the mud or try to sue us for royalties down the line, you are going to sign this non-disclosure agreement. It states clearly that you forfeit any and all intellectual property rights to the Caldwell Tower blueprints. It also mandates that you can never speak to the press, to Harrison Caldwell, or to anyone else about the internal operations of our firm." "And the familial severance part?" I asked, my voice wavering perfectly. Barbara smiled, a cold, dead expression that did not reach her dark eyes as she glared at me intensely. "It is exactly what it sounds like. By signing this document, you are formally and legally completely cutting yourself out of the Weston family trust. You will have no claim to any future earnings, assets, or properties acquired by me or your brother. You will be entirely disinherited. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of this family, you will simply cease to exist." She reached back into her designer purse and pulled out a sleek corporate checkbook. She quickly scribbled a number, tore the check free, and placed it on top of the legal papers. It was a check for $5,000. "Sign the papers, take the money, and go disappear in another state, far away from us here today. $5,000 is more than enough for you to buy a bus ticket and rent a cheap apartment in the Midwest. You can start over somewhere where nobody knows what a massive disappointment you are. If you refuse to sign, I will have my lawyers bury you in litigation for corporate sabotage and intellectual property theft. I will make sure you spend the next 10 years drowning in legal fees until you are sitting in a jail cell." I looked down at the documents and the meager check. My mind was moving a million miles an hour. Barbara thought she was trapping me. She believed she was eliminating a nuisance and completely securing her ironclad grip on the Caldwell contract without any further issues. But her legendary arrogance had completely blinded her to the reality of the situation. By forcing me to sign a complete familial severance agreement, she was legally waiving any right she or Jason might ever have to my future assets. She was officially and legally severing herself from me just hours before I was set to inherit half of a multi-billion-dollar empire. When the ironclad dual signature trust was activated tomorrow night, and the Caldwell billions flooded into my name, Barbara would have absolutely no legal standing to contest it or claim a single dime. She had brought me a shield disguised as a sword. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I reached forward and touched the thick paper before me. "You are throwing me out of the family," I whispered, forcing a tear to prick my eye. "You threw yourself out." "Tessa," Barbara replied without pity. "Now sign the document." I picked up the heavy silver pen she had placed next to the check. I took a slow, trembling breath, playing the part of the broken, defeated daughter. I signed my name on the dotted lines, initialing every single page. With every stroke, I was locking away my father's fortune permanently. I pushed the papers across and took the check. Barbara snatched the documents up immediately. She strutted away, totally unaware she'd just signed away her right to touch the Caldwell billion-dollar empire forever. I smiled, closing the trap perfectly around her greedy heart. I sat in the back seat of Harrison Caldwell's sleek town car, the tinted windows shielding me. We parked across from Le Petit Palais, an exclusive restaurant downtown. Through the sunlit windows of the restaurant, the scene was like a theatrical performance. Jason sat at a prime corner table, laughing loudly, his head thrown back in pure arrogance. Beside him sat his wife Vanessa, a woman who had never looked at me with anything less than sheer contempt. She held a crystal flute of champagne, gesturing wildly to the two socialite couples sitting across from them. Harrison sat next to me reading a digital brief. He tapped the window. "They started drinking 3 hours ago," he said mildly, "celebrating their impending empire." I watched as Jason leaned across the table, his face flushed with alcohol. He was telling the story of the boardroom twisted entirely in his favor. He mimicked a cowering posture, clearly imitating me, and the entire table erupted into cruel laughter. Vanessa kissed his cheek, raising her glass. I knew exactly what they were celebrating. They were toasting to the fact that they had finally gotten rid of the dead weight. They believed that with my signature on that severance document, they had successfully excised the only remaining threat to their absolute control. They were convinced they were about to become the most powerful architects in the city. I felt a strange, cold detachment watching them. For years, seeing them mock me would have sent a spike of humiliation straight through my chest. But sitting in the quiet luxury of Harrison's vehicle, I felt nothing but a profound calm. They were celebrating their own funeral. I turned away from the window and looked at Harrison. He had lowered his tablet and was watching me. "They think the money is already theirs," I said, my voice steady. "They have no idea what is coming tonight." Harrison gave a slow, satisfied nod. "Let them drink, Tessa. The higher they elevate themselves today, the more devastating the impact will be." He tapped the glass partition separating us from the driver. "Take us to the firm," he instructed. "We have a trust to officially activate." The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving Jason and Vanessa behind, in their bubble of manufactured triumph. We drove directly to Caldwell Industries headquarters, taking a private elevator to the executive legal suites. Harrison led me into a massive conference room where a team of 5 lawyers was already waiting, stacks of meticulously organized documents spread across the mahogany table. The lead attorney, a gray-haired man named Arthur, rose as I entered. "Miss Weston, it is an honor." I slid Barbara's severance agreement across the table. He read only a few lines before a tight smile appeared on his face. "She did this to herself," Arthur said quietly. "This document cuts her and Jason off from any future claim to your inherited assets. Once the trust is activated, they will have no legal path back to you." He placed the severance agreement into a folder, then pushed a thicker stack of papers toward me. "These are the activation protocols for your father's dual signature trust. Harrison signs first. Then you sign as Thomas Weston's verified heir. Harrison stepped up to the table, taking a fountain pen from his pocket. He signed his name with sweeping strokes, making it official. Then he handed the pen to me. "This is your legacy, Tessa," he said. "Take it all back." I took the pen. I looked down at the document, seeing my father's original signature resting at the bottom of the page. A single tear slipped down my cheek, the release of 10 years of suffocating grief. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name right next to his. The moment the ink dried, the legal trap was locked. I was no longer the ragged assistant, no longer the family scapegoat. I was the majority shareholder of the Weston Empire. The lawyers quickly gathered the documents, moving with silent efficiency to file the immediate electronic transfers. Harrison placed a hand on my shoulder and guided me out of the conference room, leading me toward his private residential suite connected to the corporate offices. "The legal mechanics are finished," he said softly. "Now it is time to address the aesthetics of your return. You cannot walk into that charity gala tonight looking like the woman they spent years trying to break." We entered the private suite, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Standing in the center of the living area was a woman holding a garment bag, surrounded by velvet boxes and a portable vanity station. Harrison had spared no expense. He had brought in a premier stylist to ensure my transformation was absolute. I was ushered into the bedroom where the stylist unzipped the dark garment bag, revealing a breathtaking custom-tailored designer gown. It was a deep, rich emerald green, crafted meticulously out of a heavy, luxurious silk that cascaded perfectly over my figure like liquid glass. The cut was elegant and commanding, designed to project absolute power and unyielding confidence. For 2 long hours, I sat in quiet contemplation as the stylist worked her magic, sweeping my hair up into a sophisticated, structured twist and applying makeup that highlighted the sharp, determined angles of my face. When she finally stepped back and turned my chair toward the full-length mirror, my breath caught tightly in my throat. The woman staring back at me was a stranger, yet she was exactly who I was always meant to be. The emerald silk hugged my frame perfectly, the fabric whispering with every slight movement. I looked powerful. I looked untouchable. I looked like my father-daughter. But there was one final, crucial detail missing. I reached over to the small table where I had placed my belongings and picked up the heavy gold band. The cracked obsidian stone felt warm against my skin. I slid the ring onto my right index finger, placing it prominently where every single person in that gala would be forced to look at it. It was the ultimate symbol of my father genius, the very foundation of the structural algorithms that Barbara and Jason had tried to steal. It was the mark of the true architect. I smoothed my hand slowly down the front of the stunning emerald gown, feeling the cool, flawless silk against my palms. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin until my posture was perfectly straight. The pieces were now perfectly in place. The legal trap was fully armed, the trust was active, and my disguise was completely shed. I walked out of the suite to meet Harrison, completely ready to bring the entire Weston facade crashing down. Harrison walked beside me, his presence a steady anchor as the polished doors slid open to reveal the Caldwell Industries annual charity gala. The massive ballroom was draped in midnight blue velvet and dripping with cascading crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across the marble floors. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided effortlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and warm, delicate appetizers. A string quartet played a soft melody from a raised balcony, but their music was nearly drowned out by the low hum of hundreds of conversations. Every major real estate developer, every billionaire investor, and prominent architectural critic in the state had gathered in this room. The air was thick with the intoxicating thrill of power. I lingered in the shadowed alcove, allowing my eyes to adjust to the brilliant light. It did not take long to spot them. Barbara and Jason had strategically positioned themselves right next to the towering champagne fountain near the center of the room. They were holding court exactly as I knew they would. Barbara was wearing a severe black velvet gown dripping in diamonds that I recognized from my father's personal safe. She had a glass of champagne in one hand and was gesturing expansively with the other, surrounded by a tight circle of eager journalists and wealthy socialites. Jason stood right beside her, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, puffing his chest out like a proud peacock. Even from across the room, I could hear Barbara's shrill, confident voice carrying over the ambient noise. She was soaking in the attention feeding off the flash of the press cameras. "We are standing on the precipice of a new era for city infrastructure," I heard her declare to a reporter from a premier financial magazine. "The Caldwell Tower is going to be the ultimate testament to the Weston legacy. My son Jason has poured his absolute genius into this design. It is a flawless masterpiece, and we are incredibly honored that Harrison Caldwell has recognized our unparalleled vision." The reporter scribbled furiously on a notepad while Jason offered a modest, practiced smile. "It was a rigorous process," Jason added, his voice loud enough to ensure the surrounding investors heard him. "But true architectural perfection requires absolute dedication. The $100 million advance we are securing tonight is just the beginning of what Weston and Associates will bring to this city skyline. We have eliminated all unnecessary distractions to focus purely on innovation." They were openly boasting about getting rid of me to cement their dominance. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I looked down at the cracked obsidian ring on my right hand. The rough, dark stone stood out in stark contrast against the smooth, liquid glass of my emerald silk gown. It was time. I stepped out of the shadows and moved toward the massive, arched double doors that served as the formal entrance to the main ballroom floor. Harrison had quietly stepped away a few moments earlier, taking a separate entrance to position himself for the trap. As I approached the threshold, four towering private security contractors in pristine dark suits materialized from the perimeter and fell into a tight protective formation around me. They were Harrison Elite Personal Security Team. I pulled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and walked straight through the grand doors. My entrance did not go unnoticed. The heavy brass handles hit the wall with a resonant thud that cut through the chatter. Heads began to turn. The vibrant emerald green of my gown caught the light, instantly drawing the eye. I walked with a slow, measured cadence, projecting absolute authority with every single step. The crowd naturally began to part, forming a wide aisle for me and my security detail. A quiet murmur rippled through the sea of wealthy guests as they took in the sight. They did not know my name, but they recognized power when they saw it. The murmurs grew louder, rippling outward like a wave, until they reached the center of the room where the champagne fountain stood. Barbara was in the middle of a sentence about her grand vision when she noticed the shift in the room atmosphere. She turned her head, her polite socialite smile still plastered on her face. Her eyes scanned the parted crowd and locked directly onto me. The smile vanished so quickly it was as if she had been physically struck. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking chalky and hollow, before a deep, angry red began to creep up her neck. She blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process what she was seeing. She recognized the ragged assistant she had banished, but she could not reconcile that image with the woman standing before her, draped in custom couture and flanked by top-tier security. Jason noticed her frozen posture and followed her gaze. His jaw dropped open, his champagne flute tilting dangerously in his hand. The shock lasted for 3 seconds before Barbara's legendary rage took over. The sheer audacity of my presence shattered her carefully cultivated public facade. "Excuse me," Barbara snapped, shoving her way past a bewildered journalist. She marched across the marble floor, her heels clicking furiously against the stone. Jason scrambled to keep up with her, looking around nervously at the watching crowd. Barbara stopped a few feet away from me, her chest heaving as she glared at the security guards blocking her path. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You have no right to be here." I simply stood there looking down at her with cool detachment. My silence only infuriated her further. She turned her wild eyes toward the nearest venue security guard standing near the wall. "Remove this woman immediately," Barbara shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my face. She is a disgruntled ex-employee who was terminated for severe psychological instability. She is trespassing at a private event. Throw this trash out into the street where she belongs right now. The venue security guard looked confused, taking a hesitant step forward, before realizing my personal security detail was not moving. The journalists who were listening to Barbara suddenly raised their cameras, sensing an explosive scandal. Flashbulbs began to pop, illuminating Barbara's furious red face. Jason grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back. "Mother, stop! Everyone is staring," he hissed desperately, but she shook him off. "I said remove her!" Barbara screamed, losing all semblance of control. Before anyone else could move, a deep, booming voice echoed from the grand, sweeping staircase to our left. "Stand down!" The command was absolute, carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. Every head in the ballroom snapped toward the stairs. Harrison Caldwell was descending the marble steps, his dark tuxedo impeccably tailored, his presence dominating the entire massive room. He walked down the remaining steps with predatory grace, the crowd falling dead silent as he approached. He bypassed Barbara completely, not even acknowledging her existence as he stepped right up to me. Harrison extended his right arm, offering it to me with a slight respectful bow. "She is not trespassing," Harrison announced, his voice echoing clearly across the silent ballroom. "She is my guest of honor." I placed my hand gently on his arm, the obsidian ring catching the glare of the flashing press cameras. Barbara and Jason stood absolutely frozen in horror, watching their entire world begin to shatter. The flashes of the press cameras illuminated my mother's pale face in a relentless strobe light. She looked completely hollowed out as Harrison rested his hand over mine. The collective murmur of the ballroom swelled into a tidal wave of confused whispers. I kept my chin high and my gaze locked ahead as Harrison led me away from the champagne fountain. We moved through the parted sea of the city elite with purposeful strides. Barbara made a desperate jerking motion as if to grab my arm, but a security guard stepped cleanly into her path. She recoiled instantly, her heavy diamond necklace catching the light as her chest heaved with suppressed rage. Jason was staring at me with a look of profound stupidity, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process how the sister he had just legally severed was draped in couture, holding the arm of the most powerful man in the room. Harrison guided me toward a raised mahogany stage constructed beneath the largest of the crystal chandeliers. A massive digital projection screen stretched across the entire wall behind the podium, displaying the sleek silver logo of Caldwell Industries. We reached the steps of the stage, and Harrison gestured for me to ascend. I gathered the heavy emerald silk of my gown and walked up the carpeted stairs. I took my place slightly to the right of the podium, standing tall and composed. Harrison followed, stepping directly up to the microphone. He tapped at once, a sharp sound that demanded absolute silence. The murmurs instantly died away. The room held its breath. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his deep voice rolling across the cavernous room. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the future of our skyline. The Caldwell Tower is a promise to this city. It is a monument to innovation's strength and the uncompromising pursuit of perfection." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the audience. I watched from my vantage point as Jason puffed his chest out slightly, adjusting his bow tie. He took a confident half step forward, positioning himself perfectly to walk up and claim his prize. When I look for an architect to execute a project of this massive magnitude, Harrison continued, his tone shifting into a sharp, unforgiving register. "I do not look for flashy presentations or manufactured prestige. I look for the raw, undeniable genius that builds empires. For months, I have evaluated the proposals submitted by Weston and Associates. I have scrutinized the blueprints, analyzed the wind shear models, and questioned the very foundation of their structural integrity. And for months, I was presented with a facade. I was presented with a design that was fundamentally flawed by people who lacked the basic comprehension to understand their own supposed work." A ripple of uneasy tension moved through the crowd. The journalists in the front row raised their digital recorders. Jason's confident smile began to strain at the edges, but he held his ground, stubbornly refusing to believe the reality unfolding right in front of him. He actually took another step forward, practically vibrating with greed, his eyes locked onto the podium. Harrison tapped the screen of the sleek digital tablet resting on the podium. The Caldwell Industries logo on the massive wall behind us vanished. In its place, the intricate, highly detailed computer-aided design files of the Caldwell Tower appeared, glowing in sharp lines of white and blue against a dark background. It was the exact model we had looked at in the boardroom, the twisting arches and the complex lattice of the central atrium. Tonight the image was magnified, displaying the sweeping beauty of the structure to the entire city elite. "It is a breathtaking design," Harrison said, gesturing to the screen. "A design that requires a specific rare kind of brilliance. Yesterday morning I witnessed that brilliance firsthand. I watched the true architect of this building step up to a terminal and rewrite a collapsing algorithm in 45 seconds. I watched a master salvage a catastrophe created by amateurs. Therefore, it is my distinct honor to announce that the $100 million contract for the Caldwell Tower goes exactly where it belongs. It goes to the true architectural genius behind the Weston legacy." Jason actually lifted his foot, preparing to mount the first step of the stage. He brought his hands up, ready to accept the anticipated applause. He was completely lost in his own delusion, entirely certain that the word genius could only ever apply to him. Harrison did not even look at him. Instead, the billionaire typed a rapid sequence of commands into his tablet. His finger hovered over the execute key for a fraction of a second before he pressed down hard. The massive screens behind us flickered violently. A low electronic hum vibrated through the ballroom speakers. I turned slightly to watch my own trap spring to life. The pristine white and blue blueprints of the Caldwell Tower suddenly began to dissolve. The clean lines fractured, breaking apart into thousands of tiny, glowing fragments. The crowd let out a collective sound of confusion as the massive building seemed to digitally collapse across the entire wall. But it did not just vanish. The fragmented code began to rapidly reform, spinning and weaving together into a completely new pattern. The soft blue light was instantly replaced by a blinding, aggressive neon green. The scattered fragments snapped into place with mathematical precision. In massive, glowing neon letters, stretching 20 feet high across the main screen, my initials appeared. T.W. Tessa Weston. But the digital watermark did not stop there. Cascading down the screen beneath my name, line after line of complex numerical code began to scroll in bright green light. They were not random numbers. They were the exact original patent codes that Thomas Weston had filed 15 years ago. The very same patents that Barbara had stolen, altered and buried to build her fraudulent empire. The green text flashed rhythmically, pulsing with an undeniable, glaring truth. Every single foundational algorithm, every load-bearing equation, and every structural innovation within the Caldwell Tower design was explicitly, legally, and digitally tied to my name and my father's original stolen work. The hidden watermark I had embedded deep within the core architecture was now broadcast for the entire world to see. The ballroom erupted. The crowd gasped in genuine shock, a sharp intake of breath that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The journalists pushed forward in a chaotic frenzy, their cameras flashing like a lightning storm, capturing the undeniable proof of the stolen intellectual property blazing across the screens. The quiet, sophisticated atmosphere of the charity gala instantly vanished, replaced by a deafening roar of scandalized whispers and frantic shouting. I looked down from the stage, my father obsidian ring feeling heavy and powerful on my right hand. Jason's confident smile completely shattered. The facade he had maintained for a decade crumbled into sheer, unadulterated panic. He stumbled backward, his face draining of all blood as he stared up at the glowing green letters, spelling out his absolute doom. He turned his head frantically toward his mother, seeking rescue. But Barbara was paralyzed. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she had seen a ghost. In a way she had. She was looking at the ghost of Thomas Weston resurrected and weaponized by the daughter she had thrown away. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of camera shutters. Harrison stood at the podium looking down at Jason with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the champagne in the glasses of the socialites standing nearby. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," Harrison said, his voice carrying a resonant authority that demanded every ounce of attention in the room. "The architectural brilliance you have been admiring all evening was never the product of Jason Weston. The file you see projecting across the screen behind me contains a deeply embedded digital history. I had my independent forensic team pull the metadata from the Weston and Associates servers this afternoon. The results were remarkably transparent." Jason took a shaky step backward, shaking his head. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the crowd. "She hacked our servers. She planted that code to ruin me." Harrison tapped the tablet again. A new window opened on the massive screen, displaying a complex but easily readable log of digital timestamps and user credentials. "This is the server log," Harrison explained. "It shows the exact moments the original code was accessed, copied, and stripped of its security encryptions. The credentials used to execute this theft belong exclusively to Jason Weston. He accessed his own sister's restricted terminal, copied her foundational algorithms, and pasted them into his own presentation file. He did not even bother to rewrite the core equations. He simply stole them outright and claimed them as his own." The murmurs in the crowd grew into a collective rumble of disgust. Investors who had been praising Jason just 10 minutes earlier were now looking at him with open revulsion. The press corps furiously recorded every word, their lenses zooming in on the damning evidence projected above us. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked to Barbara for salvation, but she was staring at the floor, her hands trembling uncontrollably at her sides. She knew the game was over. The lie they had built their entire superiority upon had been exposed in the most public, humiliating way possible. But the intellectual property theft we are witnessing tonight is merely a symptom of a much deeper, more systemic rot. Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a serious, somber pitch. "To understand the full scope of this deception, we must look back exactly 20 years. We must look at the true history of Caldwell Industries and the foundational betrayal of Thomas Weston." Barbara's head snapped up at the mention of my father's name. Her eyes were wide with a new kind of terror. "Do not do this," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the edge of the stage. "Harrison, you do not have to do this." Harrison ignored her plea completely. 20 years ago, Thomas Weston and I stood on the precipice of revolutionizing urban architecture, he told the captivated audience. Thomas was the visionary, the brilliant mind behind the algorithms that would eventually build this city's modern skyline. I was the financial backing, the man who understood the value of his absolute genius. We were partners. But Thomas was a man who trusted his family implicitly. He believed that blood meant loyalty. He was tragically mistaken. I stood tall beside Harrison, feeling the phantom weight of my father's presence beside me. I looked out at the sea of faces, watching them absorb the truth that had been hidden for 2 decades. When Thomas fell ill, Barbara Weston saw an opportunity. Harrison explained, his voice ringing with righteous anger. She systematically isolated him, stripped him of his executive voting rights, and illegally transferred his proprietary patents into her own name. She stole the empire he had built from the ground up, completely erasing his legacy and casting him out of his own firm. She built Weston and Associates on the stolen foundation of a dying man's genius. And when Thomas passed away, she turned that same ruthless cruelty upon his only true heir. She forced Tessa to work in the shadows, exploiting her inherited brilliance to prop up a mediocre son while keeping her impoverished and humiliated. The crowd was spellbound. Journalists practically climbed over each other to get a better angle. The socialites who had fawned over Barbara all evening were now taking deliberate steps away from her, treating her like she carried a contagious disease. Barbara stood entirely alone, her black velvet gown suddenly looking like mourning attire. Jason retreated behind her, trying to hide. "But Thomas Weston was far more intelligent than the woman who betrayed him," Harrison said softly, stepping out from behind the podium. He knew exactly what Barbara was capable of, and he took measures to protect his true legacy. He established a dormant, dual signature trust, locking away his remaining equity in Caldwell Industries. It was a trust that could only be activated by two keys, two physical representations of an unbreakable promise. Harrison raised his right hand high into the air. The bright light of the crystal chandeliers caught the heavy gold band on his index finger. Embedded in the center was a flawless, polished piece of dark obsidian. The crowd stared at it, trying to comprehend the significance. Tessa, Harrison said, turning to me with a look of profound respect. "Show them." I stepped forward, my emerald silk gown shifting smoothly around my legs. I raised my right hand, holding it up for the entire room to see. My father's cracked obsidian ring rested securely on my finger, a perfect match to the one Harrison wore. The camera flashes intensified into a blinding white strobe as the press documented the matching rings, the undeniable physical proof of a hidden alliance and a promise kept across 2 decades. For 10 years, I waited for the rightful heir to step out of the shadows and prove she carried her father's fire, Harrison announced, his voice booming with triumphant resonance. Yesterday morning, Tessa Weston did exactly that. She demonstrated the raw, unyielding genius that built this empire. And today, she officially activated the trust. Harrison turned back to the crowd, his posture commanding and absolute. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, raising his voice over the rising clamor of the ballroom, "I present to you the new majority shareholder of Weston and Associates. But more importantly, I present to you my official 50% partner in Caldwell Industries. Tessa Weston is the rightful bloodline heir to the billion-dollar empire that was stolen from her father 20 years ago. She is the true architect of the Caldwell Tower, and she is the future of this city." The ballroom exploded, the silence shattered into absolute chaos. A massive roar went up from the crowd, a deafening mixture of gasps and furious applause. The barrier holding back the press broke. Dozens of reporters swarmed the stage, shouting my name, thrusting microphones into the air. The continuous camera flashes formed a solid wall of blinding white light. I looked down into the chaotic sea of faces and found Barbara and Jason. They were drowning in the tidal wave of my ascension. Security guards were already moving in to herd them toward the exits. The elite circle they believed they ruled were actively turning their backs on them. They were completely and utterly ruined. In exactly 5 short minutes, they had lost their reputation, their stolen legacy, and their entire fortune. They had absolutely nothing left. The profound silence broke as Barbara lurched forward. She pushed past an investor and marched toward the stage. Her face was a mask of pure desperation and denial. "It is a lie," she screamed, her shrill voice slicing through the heavy atmosphere. She pointed a trembling finger up at the projection screen that still glowed with my initials and my father's original structural codes. "This is an elaborate forgery. My son designed that building. This wretched girl hacked the system to humiliate us." The crowd did not buy a single word of it. Seeing that her usual tactics were failing, Barbara shifted her strategy with sickening speed. The raging tyrant vanished, replaced instantly by a woman playing the role of a deeply wounded mother. She pressed her hand against her diamond necklace and looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Tessa," she pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "Tessa, please stop this madness right now. I am your mother. I have a legal right to guide this trust alongside you." It was a breathtaking display of manipulation. She thought she could invoke the maternal bond she had spent 2 decades destroying just to get her hands on my newfound wealth. I looked down at her from the stage, feeling a profound sense of closure. I reached into the emerald silk clutch I was carrying, and my fingers closed around the folded parchment waiting inside. I pulled the document out and held it up. The heavy clip binding the pages caught the light of the chandeliers. "You do not get to invoke family, Barbara," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "Not anymore." I looked at the legal papers in my hand and then back down into her desperate eyes. "You legally severed all familial ties yesterday, remember? For $5,000. I watched the exact moment the realization hit her. The manufactured tears dried up instantly and the blood rushed out of her face. I unfolded the document holding the signature page forward so the press cameras could capture it. "This is a complete familial severance agreement," I announced. "Barbara drafted this document herself and forced me to sign it yesterday morning. It explicitly states that Barbara and Jason forfeit any and all claims to my future assets, earnings, and inherited wealth. She demanded I sign away my life for a $5,000 check to ensure I could never claim a dime of the Caldwell contract. By doing so, she permanently severed herself from the trust she is now trying to claim." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd, followed immediately by harsh, mocking laughter. The sheer poetic justice of Barbara trapping herself in her own malicious legal snare was not lost on a single person in that ballroom. The mighty Weston matriarch had sold a billion-dollar empire for $5,000. Barbara staggered back as if she had been physically struck, shaking her head back and forth in absolute denial. She had engineered her own absolute destruction. Before Barbara could form another desperate lie, a sudden commotion erupted near the back of the ballroom. Four men in sharp charcoal suits pushed through the crowd with cold, practiced purpose. I recognized the man leading them from Harrison's financial dossier. His name was Victor Sterling, senior vice president of the private banking group that had funded Barbara's reckless bridge loan. Victor stopped a few feet from Jason and opened a thick leather portfolio. "Jason Weston," he said loudly enough for every investor to hear, "your firm is officially in default." Jason's face went slack. "Default? What are you talking about?" Victor's expression did not change. "Weston and Associates took a $250 million 48-hour bridge loan secured against your entire corporate asset portfolio and the expected Caldwell Tower advance. Harrison Caldwell has just publicly rejected your firm and named Tessa Weston as the true architect and partner. Your expected collateral no longer exists." He pulled out a red stamped document. "Effective immediately, the lending group is seizing your office building, corporate accounts, intellectual property portfolio, and all pledged personal properties. Weston and Associates is bankrupt. You have nothing left." The finality of those words struck Jason like a physical blow. Bankrupt, seized, nothing left. The golden boy of the Weston family, the man who had spent his entire life stealing my work and parading around as a genius, was suddenly exposed as a penniless fraud. The crowd around them physically stepped back, treating Jason and Barbara like toxic waste. Jason looked wildly around the room. He looked at the banking representatives holding his ruin in their hands. He looked at his mother, who was currently leaning against a marble pillar, gasping for air as a panic attack set in. He looked up at me, standing on the stage beside Harrison, holding the keys to the empire he had tried to steal. The reality of his total public humiliation broke whatever fragile sliver of sanity he had left. He let out a strange, high-pitched sound of pure panic and turned to run. He shoved blindly into the crowd, desperately trying to flee the ballroom and escape the hundreds of judging eyes. He just wanted to disappear. In his blind panic, he did not look where he was going. He barreled past a group of reporters and lunged toward the exit. His foot caught the heavy brass base of a tall glass cocktail table. The table tipped over with a loud crash, sending crystal glasses and champagne shattering across the marble floor. Jason pitched forward, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to catch his balance. He missed. He crashed down hard onto the floor, sliding across the spilled champagne and broken glass. His expensive bespoke tuxedo was soaked in alcohol and covered in debris. He lay there, sprawled pathetically on his stomach, groaning in pain as the entire room looked down at him. There was no sympathy. There was only cold judgment for a thief who had finally been caught. I stood silently on the stage, watching him violently struggle to push himself up from the sticky floor. All the arrogance, all the toxic entitlement, and all the cruel superiority that had defined him was completely stripped away. He was just a pathetic, broken man, lying in the ruins of his own making. I looked at Harrison, who offered me a slow, approving nod. We had dismantled them completely today. The Weston facade was completely erased, and I was finally ready to build my own future, free from their greedy, grasping hands for good now. The blue and red police lights flickered through the frosted glass windows of the grand ballroom, casting an eerie glow over the panicked faces of the remaining guests. The double doors burst open, and 4 federal agents in crisp, dark suits walked in with an unyielding authority that immediately silenced the whispers. They moved through the crowd with absolute precision, their eyes locked on the target near the destroyed cocktail table. The lead agent pulled a badge from his pocket, holding it up for the cameras to capture. "Mr. Weston, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and multi-million-dollar bank fraud." His voice boomed across the silent room. Jason was still on his stomach on the wet marble floor, his expensive suit soaked in spilled champagne and covered in shards of broken glass. He looked up at the agents, his eyes wide with a frantic primal terror. "No, wait, there has been a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high pitch as he tried to scramble backward like a cornered animal. "It was all a misunderstanding. My mother handled the paperwork. I did not know." 2 agents knelt down beside him, completely ignoring his pathetic whimpers. They grabbed his arms, pulling them forcefully behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping into place around his wrists echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. The journalists pushed forward in a chaotic frenzy, their cameras flashing relentlessly to document the golden boy of the Weston legacy being pinned to the floor by federal authorities. Vanessa stood just a few feet away, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched her husband get restrained. Her pristine gown was pristine, no longer splattered with the remnants of the fallen cocktail table. She looked at the federal agents, then down at Jason, and finally up at me, standing on the stage beside Harrison. I could see the cold, calculated gears turning behind her dark eyes. She was a woman who had built her entire existence on status and security, and she had absolutely no intention of going down with a sinking ship. With slow, deliberate movements, she raised her left hand. Her fingers gripped the massive diamond engagement ring that Jason had bought using the stolen assets of my father's firm. She slid the heavy platinum band off her finger without a single trace of emotion. She opened her hand, letting the multi-carat diamond drop directly onto the sticky champagne-covered floor beside Jason's head. It hit the marble with a dull, hollow thud. "We are finished, Jason," she muttered, her voice flat and completely devoid of warmth. "I am not going to federal prison for your pathetic failures." She turned on her designer heels and walked away, disappearing smoothly into the crowd to save herself, leaving him completely abandoned. Jason let out a strangled cry from the floor, watching her walk out. "Vanessa, please do not leave me," he wailed. His face pressed against the wet stone as the agents hauled him to his feet. He looked like a shattered, empty shell, his pride entirely dismantled in front of the city elite. Barbara watched the scene unfold, her body trembling so violently that her heavy diamond necklace clinked against her collarbone. The reality of her absolute ruin was crashing down on her all at once. Her multi-million-dollar firm was gone, completely bankrupt in a matter of minutes. Her pristine corporate reputation was obliterated, her son was being led away in handcuffs, and because of the familial severance agreement she had forced me to sign, she was completely locked out of the Caldwell billions. She was utterly destitute. The iron grip she had held over my life for 20 long years had not just slipped, it had turned into a noose around her own neck. Her knees buckled beneath her weight. She collapsed heavily onto her knees, right into the pool of spilled champagne, her expensive black velvet couture gown soaking up the sticky liquid from the floor. The press cameras swung toward Barbara as she collapsed into the champagne mascara running down her ruined face. For the first time in her life, the room was not afraid of her. It was watching her. "Tessa, please," she sobbed, reaching one trembling hand toward the stage. "I am your mother. You have the Caldwell billions now. You can still save us." I stepped to the edge of the stage and looked down at the woman who had spent 20 years making me invisible. My voice remained calm, cold, and clear through the microphone. "You cut me out of the family, forever, remember? For $5,000. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The truth had finally crushed her. Harrison stepped beside me and looked toward the federal agents. "Take them out," he said. As the agents pulled Barbara to her feet and led Jason away in handcuffs, I turned my back on them. "I am just an assistant," I said without looking back. You should learn to plan better. I did not even watch her leave. I turned my back on Barbara Wales, feeling a truly profound sense of closure settle deep into my bones. Harrison stepped up beside me, offering his arm with a quiet, respectful nod. I looped my arm through his, and we walked away from the podium together. We moved gracefully across the stage, descending the far stairs and walking straight through the parted sea of investors. The crowd watched us with silent reverence. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom closed loudly behind us, shutting out the shattered remains of the Weston Empire. Exactly 1 month later, the bright morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office. The view from the top floor of the Caldwell Industries headquarters was absolutely breathtaking. I could see the entire city skyline stretching out beneath me, a sprawling landscape of glass and steel that I was now actively shaping. The transition had been swift and incredibly satisfying. The Weston and Associates office building had been officially seized and liquidated by the banking firm. The fraudulent company was completely dissolved, erased from the architectural world, as if it had never existed. I sat back in my plush leather executive chair, simply relishing the quiet, steady hum of productivity that permeated the floor. This was certainly not a damp basement filled with the sounds of dripping pipes and buzzing fluorescent lights. This was the CEO suite of my very own architectural division within Caldwell Industries. I had my own team of brilliant designers, my own dedicated engineers, and the absolute freedom to build the future my father had always envisioned. I raised my right hand, resting my chin against my knuckles. The heavy obsidian ring sat perfectly on my index finger. I rubbed my thumb over the smooth, dark stone, feeling the deep connection to the man who had sparked my passion for structural design. He had trusted me to carry his legacy forward, and I had finally fulfilled that promise. The fire he had ignited inside me was now burning brighter than ever before. A soft chime from my sleek digital tablet broke the comfortable silence of my office. I tapped the screen, opening the morning briefing compiled by my executive assistant. Alongside the daily construction schedules and financial reports was a curated newsfeed highlighting the latest developments in the local business sector. The top headline immediately caught my attention. It was a comprehensive feature on the spectacular downfall of the Weston family. I opened the article, scanning the text with a quiet sense of vindication. The details were laid out for the entire city to read. Jason Weston was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting trial for multiple counts of corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and massive bank fraud. His bail had been denied due to the overwhelming evidence against him, including the server logs and the forged architectural patents. The former Golden Boy was facing decades behind bars, his reputation permanently destroyed. His fiancée, Vanessa, had completely vanished from the social scene, likely hunting for a new wealthy target to secure her lifestyle. But the update on Barbara was the most poetic consequence of all. The article featured a grainy photograph taken through the glass doors of a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. Barbara Weston, the woman who had spent her entire life dripping in stolen diamonds and looking down on the working class, was now sitting behind a chipped laminate desk. According to the article, she had been forced to take a minimum wage job as a night shift receptionist just to afford the mounting legal fees for her son's criminal defense. The couture gowns were gone, replaced by a faded polyester uniform. The luxury mansions and charity galas were nothing more than a distant memory. She was living the exact life of servitude and struggle she had so cruelly forced upon me for 20 years. I locked the tablet screen, pushing it to the corner of my expansive mahogany desk. A genuine, peaceful smile spread across my face. The anger and resentment that had driven me for so long had completely evaporated, leaving behind a clear, focused ambition. The past was finally buried, and the people who had tried to destroy me were exactly where they belonged. The revenge was complete. I reached across my desk and grabbed a thick, cylindrical cardboard tube. I pulled the cap off and slid out a large sheet of drafting paper. I spread the crisp blueprint across the smooth wooden surface, securing the corners with heavy brass paperweights. It was a new design, a sprawling, sustainable cultural center destined for the heart of the downtown district. The lines were sharp, the calculations were flawless, and the architecture was entirely my own. I picked up my favorite drafting pen, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of it in my hand. I leaned over the desk, taking a deep breath of the fresh air circulating through the room. I smiled again, letting the light catch my father's ring one more time before I lowered my head and got to work. The spectacular downfall of the Weston family serves as a powerful reminder that an empire built on deception is inherently fragile. Barbara and Jason spent decades constructing a brilliant facade fueled entirely by stolen genius and manipulation. They believed that entitlement and ruthlessness could permanently mask their lack of actual talent. However, a legacy with no authentic foundation cannot withstand the light of truth. Tessa's journey teaches us the profound value of patience and undeniable skill. For years, she was forced into the shadows, her hard work exploited by the very people who should have protected her. Yet she did not allow their abuse to extinguish her drive. She honed her craft, quietly embedded the proof of her brilliance, and waited for the perfect moment to reclaim what was hers. True talent cannot be permanently stolen. Your hard work always leaves a watermark. Perhaps the most difficult yet liberating lesson is that blood relations do not obligate you to endure abuse. Barbara attempted to weaponize the concept of family only when she had lost all other leverage. Tessa's calm refusal to be manipulated demonstrates that walking away from toxic relatives is not an act of cruelty, it is a necessary act of self-preservation. You owe absolutely nothing to those who only value you for what they can extract. You have the right to legally and emotionally sever ties that bind you to a life of misery. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from a toxic environment to protect your own future and peace of mind? Share your story of resilience in the comments below. If Tessa's ultimate triumph over betrayal resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice, strength, and claiming the success you truly deserve.